Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced, candidate for Comptroller for New York City. Now today what I want to do is talk about Scott Stringer's new proposal, the current Comptroller, on affordable housing. Now the current proposal, as it was kind of stated in the newspapers and in press releases, is to use the money in the pension fund to give loans out for affordable housing. Now, of course, there will be financial standards, and generally it would be crazy if they didn't have some sort of standards on who they'd give the loans to. From what I can tell, it seems like what they're doing is that they're trying to make it easier for people to stay in their homes by giving them new mortgages at lower rates. So it's not necessarily allowing people to buy new homes, but taking people who may currently be paying, let's say, 6% on their mortgage and giving them a cheaper mortgage at, let's say, 5%. And I'm assuming it's 5% because they kind of hinted at a standard or a stable 5% return, which I'll come back to. Now, while this sounds like a interesting plan where, in a sense, you give the pension fund a set return, a fixed return at the same time, help New Yorkers, there are some fundamental problems with this plan. And while I applaud efforts to address the issue of affordable housing here in New York, the problem is that you're doing it with the retirement money of teachers, firefighters, police officers who didn't necessarily volunteer that the money that has been put away for their retirement, for their golden years, to be used to do all these different policies. The main focus of what should be done with their money is to make sure you're achieving the return to fund their retirements. Now, in that, this particular proposal proposes three problems, or at least three large questions from my perspective. The first one is the returns. Currently, the way the New York City pension system functions is based on a 7% assumed return, which it hasn't reached the last few years. In the 2016 report, or at least in the report released June 30th, 2016, the pension funds returned a little bit over 1%. So they're already returning way below that 7% benchmark, which is why we're putting in millions, hundreds of millions of dollars in catch-up payments, near $1 billion over the next few years. So though making sure you hit those returns is important, but the idea is that how much you contribute every year is based on your assumed return. And right now that's 7%. So even though I am for, part of why I'm running for a comptroller is to push the idea of a 5% assumed return in the pension fund, long as the return is assumed to be 7%, we're actually going to be putting in less money into the fund, which means even if you are achieving a 5% return, you're going to be underfunded. Okay, because you're not necessarily contributing what a 5% would need in order to maintain sort of a sustainable amount in the fund, to keep the pension fully funded. So while 5% return may be better than what the pension funds achieved in 2016, or again in the report released June 30th, 2016, it doesn't necessarily prevent or protect New York City taxpayers from future catch-up payments, because again the liabilities are based on a 7% return. So this is why I want to push the idea of having that discussion of moving down to a 5% return, so that way we can line reality up with our assumptions. Now, my second issue with this proposal is liquidity. Now, mortgages are not a liquid instrument. And what is liquidity? The ability to take your investments and get out of them and turn them into cash. And the reason why that's important is because you never know what's going on in the economy. I mean, making loans, affordable loans for affordable housing, can oftentimes present certain risks. And as we saw in 2008 through the housing crisis. And in a situation like that, if you can kind of see those tailwinds coming, you're going to want to be able to get out of those investments before they turn sour. And mortgages are not something that's very liquid. Now, there's a couple of possibilities of how you could deal with that. They could be trying to create Ginnie Mae conforming mortgages, which would be mortgages for FHA redevelopment zones or for veterans, which were referred to in the article. But then basically all they're doing is they're not necessarily making a 5% return. They're just going to flip those mortgages over to Ginnie Mae and make some money on fees, and essentially they become countrywide. And I don't know if we necessarily want the pension fund in New York City becoming sort of that sort of mortgage loan shark, like a lot of those firms you saw in movies like The Big Short, etc. Not necessarily the business we want to get in, because it may start nobly, but it builds up. On top of another way you could do the liquidity is you could package them into derivatives, where they maybe this New York City decides to make a lot of these affordable loans and then repackage them as asset-backed securities. Those CMO tranche, those credit derivatives that everyone kind of are now fearful about because of 2008. Doesn't necessarily mean these are bad products or bad routes to go, but it still doesn't necessarily, while those may provide liquidity, it doesn't necessarily, again, achieve the result of return, the first problem that I cited, and then the potential risk. 4 or 5% return when you're making loans on affordable housing, and it's not just about the mortgage rate. So basically, by making these lower interest loans to people who already have higher interest mortgages, you may shave their monthly expense for living where they are for a little bit. But New York City's property taxes have continued to go up. Assessments and property values have continued to go up, which means, and that's another factor of what's been pushing a lot of people to move out and sell their homes. The fact that basically they can't keep up with the taxes. And then on top of that, that pushes up the cost of everything around them, whether it's where they go get their groceries and the cost of transportation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that's pushing people to sell and leave. This doesn't necessarily deal with that. So you have a potential of risk on these loans, and people who may get still financially unable to pay these loans in the future because of the squeeze that occurs in New York City in New York City living costs. Or they may sell and you achieve a much lower return, and again, in the meantime, you don't have the liquidity you would have in other investments that may be safer and achieve a more predictable return, such as investment-grade debt, liquid investment-grade debt, or even blue-chip securities that it can achieve a predictable return. You can hit that 5% return without taking too much risk, and you'll have much more liquidity, and people's retirements would be a lot more safer that way. Now, then that begs the question, should we be paying politics with pension fund money? Because this is not the first time we've seen proposals like this from the administration of Scott Stringer as Comptroller of New York City. There's been times where they've allocated money to green energy, which there's nothing wrong with green energy, but it is a risky sector. It is a risky investment, and when we're not achieving our current benchmarks, it's the worst time to be trying to take those risks and play politics and basically use pension fund money for virtue signaling. The only priority that should be right now is having a portfolio that achieves a sustainable return, a predictable return that's safe with the liquidity to be able to get out of those investments. This will protect the pensioners, the people who are going to retire off that money, but it also protects New York City taxpayers from those future possible catch-up payments to catch up for shortfalls. And that is not the discussion that I'm hearing from the office of Scott Stringer. I just see political maneuvering, oftentimes obviously seeming like he's positioning himself for a mayoral run 4 years from now, by addressing issues that are not necessarily front, dead, and center in the pension world, using other people's pension money. But then how do you fix affordable housing? Now, as comptroller, all you can really do is kind of highlight what are those things that need to be needed and make those recommendations to City Council. Now, if you want to address affordable housing, you have to address the issues that are driving up prices and driving people out. Because it's not just, again, the price of housing, the price you have to pay to live where you live every month. That's certainly part of it, and it's certainly growing quickly. But it's also just the cost of living in general and the opportunities to generate an income to afford that rising cost of living here in New York City that are pushing people out and causing a lot of people who've called New York their home for decades to go to greener pastures. I've recently been spending time in Orlando on a family trip, and many of the people I met were former New Yorkers who just basically couldn't afford to live in New York anymore. So generally I attribute 3 particular things that really drive housing prices in New York City. One I've already mentioned, and that's taxes. As property values go up, Not only that means your property tax bill is already going up, but on top of that, the property tax percentage itself has gone up over the last decade multiple times, and that squeezes people out. Now, when it comes to providing new housing, because one way you can drive housing prices down and make housing affordable is to have more units. Now, part of that is our policies regarding housing, whether it's our zoning laws. I'm not for rezoning, but I am for no zoning. If you take a look at places like Houston, they have similar population growth that New York City has, but they don't necessarily have the same rate of increase in the cost of housing. And that's mainly because they don't have zoning laws that prevent the capacity or the amount of housing units to hit the market. So that way you have new units for housing growing as fast as the population's demand is. You don't have that in New York City. There's a lot of control on where you can build, what you can build, how you can build it, etc. On top of that, regulations and contracts that the city has that create certain costs. So that has two effects. Zoning laws, one, restrict the amount of units that hit the market. And again, this is not just a free market libertarian perspective. This is something that even progressive economists have written in the book "The Rent Is Too Damn High" by Matt Iglesias, a very progressive economist who wrote a book on this very issue. Now, on that note, other regulations and whatnot drive the cost to create that housing higher. So even if you stay within the zoning rules, a lot of the rules make it more expensive to make the housing, which means the housing you do make has to be sold at a higher price. So if those fixed costs can go down, well, then the cost per unit can go down as well. Okay, any business has to create something that it can sell at a profit. So if you keep imposing cost upon cost upon cost on something, then you're going to naturally drive the price higher. Okay, so a lot of the bureaucracy, a lot of the permitting, whatnot, it's not the permitting itself, but sometimes the inefficiency in the process and the cost of that inefficiency. Because if you're waiting an extra 6 months, or an extra 3 months, or an extra month for a particular permit to do a particular thing, there are costs associated with that wait that end up increasing the cost of the final product. And then last is reassessing how we address our homeless problem. Currently, we have policies that were put in decades ago regarding how we deal with homeless and making sure everyone who's homeless has a roof over their head. The problem is that it's really soaked up inventory as far as possible housing units and driven up the cost of rent, where people who otherwise wouldn't be homeless are now homeless. They're people who are making a living. They make maybe even the median income of the country, but are still homeless here in New York City because we've driven up the cost of living so high. So if you could free up that market, so again, through regulations and zoning reforms, you could do that to an extent. But the problem is right now we have a situation where basically we have hotels where almost all the units are taken up to house homeless. And there's nothing wrong with that, but the problem is when you house those homeless, that means you shrink the supply of hotel units, and on top of that, those hotels don't pay property tax because that's part of the arrangement. So you're getting less revenue for the city to pay for this policy, and at the same time, the cost of everyone to go to New York City as a tourist becomes higher, which tourism is a big industry for New York City, so that hurts tourism dollars when that happens, when you have hotel inflation. On top of that, a lot of apartment units are used to house people who from the shelters, which is fine. And a lot of times, these people from shelters who are going into these units are people who probably could have otherwise afforded an apartment if you had a normal housing market here in New York City. So there are reforms that can happen. If we reform these policies that are restricting the supply of available housing in New York City, you can bring prices down to a reasonable amount. It is doable. Okay, there are things that you can't control. New York City doesn't have the land mass that Houston does, or the empty lots. But there are ways to expand our units of potential housing and expand them faster and cheaper, and without sacrificing safety, quality of life, and things like that. but we're not doing them, and a lot of it's for political reasons. There's a lot of entrenched interests. It's just the nature of politics. But as comptroller, I'm going to call that stuff out and touch, the third rails of politics that need to be touched, because someone's got to do it. My name is Alex Merced, and I'm running for New York City Comptroller. Check out my website, alexmercedforny.com, for more information on how you can get involved. Thank you very much.